So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to cache some data. By this, I mean we're going to take the response from our HTTP GET and cache it by essentially putting it inside of our donuts array. But we're also going to look at this concept of an observable pipe. And this isn't too dissimilar to something like this, where we're doing array find, and we've also got array map, and also array filter. So if you're confident with a map, a filter, there's not really too much to learn with observables, because it follows this same functional programming paradigm. Now, an observable is a slightly different mechanism. However, it follows the same principles, and the way that the data flows through an observable is also slightly different. But for this, we don't need to worry about things too much, because we're going to take things one step at a time. So we have our HTTP GET. Now, an observable is a really nice mechanism, because if we look at our list, we have our subscribe. So try and follow this as best as you can. When our donut service requests our .read, things are then going to kick off in our service, and then when that has finished, it's going to come back with the result and then pass it to us inside of our subscribe. Now, what we can in fact do is use a pipe on this side of the observable. We can absolutely use it on this side of the observable. For instance, here you can see we can say .pipe. However, we're going to keep things nice and contained. So inside of our service, we're going to introduce this method called pipe. Now, what does this pipe do? It allows us to specify a few things which are going to happen after our HTTP GET has completed. Now, it might be nice to bump this down onto a new line so that we can see things a bit clearer. Now, a pipe allows us to now specify multiple things. So let's say we want to map over our data. We then want to do something else, A pipe is where we can do this and pass in pure functions to achieve exactly this. So my question now is, what do we want to do after we have made our HTTP GET? Now, beforehand, we were doing return this.donuts, and yes, our data is being fetched here, but if we were to click on one, go through to another route, and then come back, we'd have to load the data all over again. So it makes sense for us to take this piece of code and then add it to our state. Now, a pipe is the perfect place to do this because it's going to execute as soon as our subscribe is called. So what's going to happen is our GET will be made, the pipe will be run, and then whatever we do inside of the pipe, it might be that we transform the data, it might be that we just simply provide an effect, which is exactly what we're going to do, and we're going to provide the data straight into our donuts array. Now, to do this, we're going to tap into our response. And coincidentally, there is an operator that we're going to import, and this is called the tap. So we can hit enter. Now, our tap definition gets imported automatically, and you can see here that we have import tap from RxJS. Now, I like to keep my Angular and RxJS stuff at the top, and I also like to separate them out. So we have Angular, RxJS, and then our application code. And I think that this keeps our files then nice and predictable, in the nice order and nice and clean. We know where to go, rather than having things completely mixed up and it becomes a huge mess. So now that we have this tap, this is essentially going to have no side effects, but our tap is actually going to give us our donuts. So let's first log it out and actually see this in motion. So we can press save. So if we jump into our browser DevTools, we then have this array with 5 values in. Now, at the moment, we have cannot read properties of undefined reading the length property inside of our donut list template. So let's go and fix this, because this is happening due to the fact that our donuts has no initial value. Now, what we could do is set this to an empty array, which then means we can get rid of this, and this completely fixes the problem. However, we can go one better and use a safety check in Angular via the safe navigation operator. So the line of code which is actually erroring, you can see our error message is on line number 10, column 22. So we can take line number 10, and it's this donuts here. Now, because we're not specifying a value, and this is now coming back asynchronously. Now, before it didn't matter because it was synchronous, and we were also specifying an empty array as the value. But now we need to safety check things by using the question mark. So this is basically saying if the donuts is existing, then I want to look at that length property. So we can save this out, and we then have no errors, and our donut service is now logging those 5 items out. So I hope you understand this. We have our pipe, which is branching off. It's just tapping into the data after our GET request is being made. So the GET then passes the data to the pipe. That is exactly what's happening. And whatever functions we pass in here are going to execute in order. So if we were to pass in a different function and then another function, the first function would run, and then whatever we do inside it, the data then gets passed to the next function. Now, I'm telling you this, but it might make more sense for you when we actually come on to chaining some operators to see them in action. So don't worry about it too much just now. Using tap has no effect on the data transformation, so this makes it a perfect place to then perform an operation such as this.donuts equals our array of donuts. So you can think of this as a side effect. And you can see here when I'm pressing save, it's adding these brackets around it because it's treating it as an expression. If you wanted to, you could use a function something like this and specify the function body. And I'm going to leave it like this because I think this is a bit neater, and our tap is then nicely displayed on one line. We don't really care about having the pipe. We just want to know what's happening inside. So this tap is allowing us to provide a side effect after our HTTP has been completed. And we're going to use some more operators before we finish out this chapter and tie things together really nicely. In doing so, we'll hopefully start to unravel your RxJS journey as well. Now, the benefit of doing this is we can do something like this now. We can say if this.donuts.length, then we know that the data has already been loaded, in which case we can just simply return this.donuts. So this is allowing us to then specify some nice caching and not making another HTTP request if our data has already been loaded. Upon our first .read call, our HTTP get's going to fire off. We then have our tap, which then stores the data internally to our service. And let's say we navigate to another component and then go back to this component. Because our data will already be fetched, the length property is going to evaluate as truthy, and we'll just simply return the donuts that are already there. So this will help speed up our application by not allowing the user to click around and feel like the application is slow because we'd be loading the data each time. As soon as we've loaded it, we're going to store it inside of the service as a piece of state management. So we're treating the service as what we would call a store. Now what's interesting is if we jump into our donut list, we now have an error. We have property subscribe does not exist on type donut array or an observable donut array. So what does this mean? It means that we are passing back, you can see this.donuts is just a donut array, whereas this is returning us an observable of donut array. So essentially we need to return this as an observable to then allow us to use the exact same syntax. So if the data exists, we just unravel an observable by calling subscribe. And at that point, we don't really care whether we are getting our observable, which the data is already loaded, or we're going to go and fetch a new one. So what we can simply say is of, and then pass in our this.donuts. Now this of is imported from RxJS. So now we need to go up next to our tap. We have of. So what this is doing is allowing us to create our own observable. And it doesn't matter what data we pass into of. So here we're essentially just using an observable wrapper around our data set. And the only reason that we're doing this is so we can then, inside of our list, call subscribe directly. So what this means is, if we don't have any data, our read is going to take care of an HTTP GET. We can then subscribe to the returned observable from HTTP GET and get the data. Or if the data is already available, we're just going to pass it back as an observable anyway. So we're just using the observable paradigm to allow us to directly subscribe in one way or another. It doesn't matter which. Now, the other great reason for doing this is because when we come to implementing a click-through on a product, we're also going to call this.read inside of here. So what this is going to do, when we visit a single product, if no data is available, it's going to go and load it, then it's going to go and set it, and then what we're going to do is go and find the data. So with this in mind, we've completed quite a nice lesson on caching our state on our service by treating it as a store. We can then pass this service around and it's going to flawlessly work in any component that wants to consume the data. We've then talked about this observable being returned from HTTP GET and also returning our own static variable, which kind of acts as synchronous. So it is resolved then immediately, which means that as we continue through our application build, and especially in the next chapter on routing, we're going to see this transition between pages absolutely immediately. We're not going to be loading data on every click, which would then give us quite a bad experience. So now we have implemented this. In the next lesson, we're going to dive into read one because we have quite an interesting thing to set up here. We're then going to change our application component back to our form. We're then going to load a piece of data in by using our existing read function. We're then going to grab the data, that single piece of data that corresponds to the ID. And then we've got some more HTTP verbs to then contend with. We want to create some data, save it in the database, update the data, go into our database and actually change it, and delete some data from our database. Now, our db.json allows us to do this automatically when we specify our HTTP verbs. So let's dive in and start implementing our read one.